yourself because this is your story, but we would love to hear about your traveling childhood, your early career in iBanking, the catalyst to your pivot to baking, how you landed on cupcakes, of course, and where all of this has taken you. We'll do that to start, and then we'll get into questions.
Absolutely. So the hardest question for me to answer is when someone asks where I'm from. And the reason for that is that I constantly moved around as a child. I was born in Jakarta, Indonesia. Then I moved to Hong Kong. Then I moved to the upper Midwest. Then we moved back to Asia. Then I went to school in New England. Then I came out to California. And so I had this very peripatetic childhood. And because these were analog days, and this was pre-Netflix, this was pre-Amazon, I often felt really secluded and isolated, and I really was homesick. Like I missed the States, and I felt so distant. So really one of the only things I could do to remind myself of home was to bake the treats that I missed from home. And certainly when I was craving a brownie or a chocolate chip cookie or a Rice Krispie treat, I wasn't going to be able to get them at the corner store on the island of Sumatra. So I had to make them myself. And my mom and I spent hours and hours in a kitchen cooking over her, from her Joy of Cooking cookbook. And it was just a really fun hobby and passion, but it also was very meaningful in a deeper way for me because it connected me to my homeland. So, fast forward, obviously, went to school, went to college, and then was recruited into investment banking. So banking definitely took a back seat. I was busy working those 16-hour days in banking, crunching numbers, literally sleepless nights. It was crazy amounts of work and so stressful, and everything was, 11th hour emergency. And I was just like, oh my God, this job is a nightmare. I've just got to make it through my 2-year analyst program and then I'll figure it out. So at the time, it was the late 90s. It was the height of the dot-com boom. And all of these early internet companies were coming up. So like eBay and Amazon, this was the time when all of these companies were being born. And they were all basically coming to life in San Francisco, which is where I was at the time. So I went to go work for an early internet company, which tons of people were doing at the time because everybody wanted to go get their stock options and make their millions. And it was a very buzzy, frothy time. And it was a lot of fun. But of course, the good times didn't last forever. The dot-com bust rolled around and all of these early internet companies went bust. And so lots of people were out of a job, and that included me. And so for the first time ever, I was just kind of aimless. I didn't have a high flying paycheck coming in. And I really had to ask myself the tough question of well, what now? And by the way, a few months after I lost my job, 9/11 happened. So that led to some deeper, soul searching and kind of what I really wanted, not just out of a job, but out of my life. I had this epiphany that I really wanted to do something that brought me joy. So that led me back to baking. And there happened to be a pastry school right down the street from where I lived in San Francisco. And much to everyone in my life's surprise, I decided to go to pastry school instead of business school, because that was definitely what a lot of my friends were doing. It was what most people in my position would have done as the logical next step. But I wanted to pursue something that was meaningful and that brought me joy. And I was so tired of crunching numbers. I didn't know what I was going to do with this skill yet, but I knew I had to try it. So I went to pastry school and I realized I loved it. I loved how tangible, working with dough was, making cakes, creating something that I could then give to someone and watch them enjoy was rewarding in a whole new way. And so after pastry school, I just started baking cakes out of my little apartment. I thought, I don't know what I'm doing yet, but I'm just going to start and I'm going to figure it out on the way. And I made these beautiful, multi-tiered layered cakes, and they were super creative because I was mixing colors and working with fondant and, sculpting sugar to make these cakes so special. And they were creatively fulfilling, but they were a business dead end. I knew there was nothing scalable about what I was doing. So at the time, I remember I just recently gotten married and there was a new trend on the wedding scene. It was these beautiful towers of cupcakes that some brides were choosing instead of the traditional wedding cake. Meanwhile, when you walk through the supermarket, you saw stacks of plastic clamshells filled with these like shelf stable cupcakes. So on the one hand, there were these very elegant, very personalized cupcakes that were kind of happening on the wedding scene. And on the other hand, here was this beloved treat that everyone in America had grown up with and loved, and it was nostalgic, but they were just like a commodity. They were super basic. And so I had this aha moment as I was walking through the grocery store, like, what if I elevated the lowly cupcake? Because I knew that a cupcake conceivably could be something that someone would eat on a daily basis, right? Unlike a special occasion cake. So it had, this incredible quality of being scalable. And I just loved cupcakes. They're innately American. It sort of spoke to my passion for American desserts, which I'd grown up with. And I saw an opportunity. And in spite of the fact that everyone thought it was really, really bad idea, I went for it.
I love that. I read somewhere in your book that you said like something along the lines of like a good business idea is something that like the customer needs every day.
Mm.
So how did you make this leap towards or at least to having faith that someone would need the cupcake every day?
I had this really big vision. I thought if I could reinvent the lowly cupcake, something that kids love, right? Like kids would eat them at birthday parties, they'd get them in their lunchbox. But by the time we'd grown up, we'd outgrown cupcakes. We still had this special warm feeling about them, but they weren't that fun to eat. So I had this idea that if I could elevate cupcakes, make them special, make them aspirational, make them elegant so that they would appeal to adults as well as to kids, while still, keeping that playful, joyful quality of the cupcake. I could expand the market. And if I could do a great job of branding it too, I could build a business on that and just focusing on that one product, selling cupcakes. Because there was also something that I really loved about this idea of doing one thing and doing it really well, which when I was growing up was something that I saw in a lot of cultures, but not in America, right? America was and still is, for the most part, the land of the supermarket.
Yeah.
Whereas when you go overseas, it's like, oh, you might go and get your cheese at the cheese shop, or you might go and get your fish at the fishmonger. Like that wasn't, America's like their one-stop shopping. And so I thought, let's do things differently. Let's elevate this thing that people love, and let's focus on that and create a cupcake and a cupcake bakery experience unlike anything anyone's ever seen. But although I had a burning passion for this idea, nobody else believed in it. So the first thing people asked me when I said, what I was going to do is, well, don't you think there's a reason why this doesn't exist yet? It's probably not a good idea. There's a reason why bakeries have to sell a whole suite of products. It's what they have to do to survive. And then on top of that, by this time, my husband and I had decided to move down to Los Angeles to start this business because the economy in San Francisco was still really struggling from the dot-com bust. And Los Angeles is not known for people eating a lot of carbs. And on top of that, it was the height of the low-carb diet. So there were so many signs pointing to this not being a good idea. But I ultimately had this fire in my belly, and I had this determination to see this dream out. And I think the reason I had such, that I was strong enough and courageous enough to stick it out is because I thought about the alternative. Could I live with the alternative, which was I don't pursue this idea, and then somebody else does it, runs away with it, and then I am left for the rest of my life saying, oh, I should have done that. And I realized that even if I were to go for it and fail, that would be preferable to the regret I would feel if somebody else took it and ran away with it.
I so know that feeling. I really know that feeling. And I also appreciate you trusting your gut despite really, I mean, there were so many high stakes risks here that you just there was a laundry list of them. So good on you, because you fulfilled this vision. I'm going to move to our first question here, which is, how do you befriend failure? You talk a lot about that in your book, but then at the same time, navigate and surpass this imposter syndrome. It really feels like an oxymoron here, but it's like, we face failure every day, but then we've kind of got to stand up on our 2 feet and like I said, just kind of work in the face of the constant imposter syndrome. So any advice for us as we're navigating that?
I do think it sounds counterintuitive, but I do believe that sort of coming to terms with failure, embracing failure, making friends with failure, however you want to phrase it, is actually really important for taming imposter syndrome. And the reason is that once you have challenged yourself, stretched yourself outside your comfort zone, possibly failed, and then lived to tell about it, you're stronger on the other side. And you've built your confidence to realize that you're strong enough to handle it, right? And it's that strength, that resilience, and that persistence when you get up time and time again after failure, that builds the confidence to allow you to believe you can tackle anything, including imposter syndrome, which is basically, feeling like you're in a room where you don't belong. And once you start exercising that muscle enough times, you don't let it stop you. It doesn't necessarily mean that nagging feeling is going to go away, but you're not going to let it stop you because you've exercised that muscle, you've strengthened your resilience, you've strengthened your resolve. And so imposter syndrome is not a big deal anymore. I think as a society, we do a terrible job with failure. I'd like to share a couple of the acronyms I mentioned in my book, which is FAIL is first attempt in learning, or forever acquiring important lessons. And my favorite quote about failure is ascribed to Winston Churchill, and it's, "Success is stumbling from failure to failure without loss of enthusiasm." I think failure is, we ignore it as a society and we celebrate the success, the pot of rainbow at the end. But the more you study successful people, the more you notice the failures, the obstacles, those humble first beginnings that they had to overcome to get to where they are. I am always amazed by the story of the founder of Canva, who heard no's from 100 VCs before she got her first yes. I mean, if you think about how some people want to crumble after they hear their first no, then think about how hard it is to hear no 5 times in a row, then 10. I mean, the fact that she wasn't in a puddle or curled up in the fetal position on the floor, right? And now this company is worth $30 billion. Like, that is so inspiring. And that wouldn't have happened if she hadn't put herself out there and just embraced failure. And I'm sure every single man who she was pitching made her feel intense imposter syndrome, but she's having the last laugh.
No kidding. Yeah, I remember like listening to her story on How I Built This, which is clearly my favorite podcast.
I love that podcast too.
On every webinar. But I remember her saying, like, she slept on people's couches in Silicon Valley, just, pitching and pitching. And it's the same story with Peloton. I think he said he did 90 pitches a week, and was turned down again and again. So yeah, it's so tough, but just kind of, you mentioned kind of like resilience, grit. Yeah, it's really important to have that.
Speaking of which, this photo is making me laugh because speaking of imposter syndrome, this was so early in my career, after, launching Sprinkles, and Martha Stewart had always been my idol. There were so many days where I just felt like, after losing my job, I was just aimless, and she and her show really helped me kind of go back to baking and reclaim this passion of mine. And so all of a sudden, when I was asked to be on her show and I was standing there making cupcakes with Martha, it was just like, what am I doing here? It was so awe-inspiring.
Totally surreal. I think we skipped ahead a couple of yeah, there we go. I was going to take that one anyways, but yeah, let's go to question 2 because we're kind of like building a story here. But how do you define unique insights, and how do we find ours? Because a lot of business is not necessarily, well, I don't know if reinventing, now I'm like overthinking the phrase that I was going to use, reinventing the wheel, but we most ideas are spoken for. It's just about doing them better. So how do we find our unique insight, and how do you define that?
I think your unique insight is sort of what you see that other people don't. It's your unique set of experiences and background and perspective that allows you to see the world through a uniquely distinct lens. And my unique insight was just this mashup of experiences and, perspective, and everything that made me me was what allowed me to see that Sprinkles was an opportunity when nobody else could. So it was the fact that I was experienced, like I was immersed in the baking world, right? I was going to pastry school. I was studying all these bakeries. I knew everything about the cake decorating industry. Every time I went to a cafe or bakery, I'd taste the treats, and I was constantly developing my palate and trying to understand, like, what was out there in the market, what wasn't. Then there was my unique upbringing, right? This fact that I had this passion for American desserts, and also that I kind of wanted to celebrate them, almost as if I was an outsider, almost as if I was like, I was an expat most of my life, right? So I kind of had a special affinity for American desserts, which drew me to cupcakes. And then it was also just the fact that I lost my job, and I was like, what the heck, let's do this. So it was all of these unique things that allowed me to see this opportunity for Sprinkles that other people didn't. And a lot of times, that comes from your personal upbringing. It comes from, your education, your background in terms of your work experience. But it also comes from a mindset where you are open to opportunity, right? If you are walking around kind of leaning into personal frustrations and kind of using those as, I don't know, like a way to test what the market needs, as opposed to just getting frustrated and kind of forgetting about them, that's going to lead you to opportunities that other people don't see. I mean, when I think about how I came up with the Sprinkles Cupcake ATM, that was really leaning into a unique insight based on the fact that I was pregnant, I was having a hormonal craving late at night, and I was open enough to opportunity. I was leaning into this personal frustration. So instead of saying, I can't get a cupcake at midnight, this is so annoying, and rolling over and going to bed, I said, I can't get a cupcake at midnight, but that's a problem. And I wonder if there's other people like me who want a cupcake late at night. I bet there are. And how can I make that happen? So that's sort of the difference, right? Between the entrepreneur and this entrepreneurial mindset, drawing from your unique insight, versus just the average everyday human who's going to, not think about it for much longer.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to move to the next question so that we can save some time for our audience questions here. But you just kind of talked a little bit about stress testing. So can you provide some examples of your stress testing of ideas, and how do you accurately calculate demand? A lot of us have these ideas and we're sure that the market is ripe for them, but it's not necessarily ripe for them. And sometimes we, get into the weeds and we're so far into a business and building out that business and realize that the market opportunity isn't really there. So how do you properly calculate that demand?
Yeah, I think entrepreneurship is not about taking a flying leap off a cliff, right? There is obviously risk inherent in the entrepreneur's journey, but it is about taking a calculated risk. So as much as you can stress test your idea, test demand in the market on a smaller scale before you go all in, you have to do it. I did that with Sprinkles by baking out of my kitchen first. And initially, product seeding around town. I delivered my cupcakes to salons and concierges. I brought them to every party. I passed out business cards. It was humbling. It was humiliating at times, but I did it. And eventually, this push that I was like pushing my product into the world felt like a little bit of a pull because my phone started ringing more. And all of a sudden, I was getting these very high profile people within the LA entertainment community calling me. One of them was the producer for the Tyra Banks show. She wanted my cupcakes for Tyra's 30th birthday. And I thought, okay, I think I'm onto something. Now, having said that, I knew there was demand, but I did not accurately calculate the demand because on opening day, we had cupcakes for about 2.5 hours before we were out. So we had, and you can't scale up recipes and equipment and all of that overnight. So probably for the first few months that Sprinkles was, around, we had lines down the block, we had bare cupcake cases. And what was interesting about it was it didn't discourage people. It actually sort of lit the fire even more because the scarcity fueled almost like a FOMO. We were flying in the face of what everyone expected, first of all, by being a cupcake business in the heart of Beverly Hills at the height of the low carb craze. But then it's like, I was charging $3 for these luxury cupcakes. Why are they so expensive? And then on top of that, you can't even get them. You can't get your hands on them. So all of this kind of like fueled this demand and this fire. But there's so many different ways that you can stress test an idea, which include, conducting surveys, making sure that they are not your family and friends. So you make sure that, you're getting actual objective opinions and not just what your family and friends think you want to hear. You can run a crowdfunding campaign on like a Kickstarter or an Indiegogo and also raise awareness, but also raise funds for your idea. You can analyze search terms, use a keyword research tool to kind of get a sense of whatever your idea is. Are searches trending upward? Are there a lot of search terms for that? You can build a prototype if you're talking about a product, build a MVP, minimum viable product, and just give it away for free and get people's feedback, get a sense of if they would pay for it. And even running targeted ads on like Instagram and building a wait list, you can get a sense of demand before you even start delivering a product. Mm-hmm. And many successful CPG founders have done just that, like the founder of Native Deodorant.
I'm just curious, what was the timeline between you testing it out, sort of DIYing it, and then opening your first Sprinkles bakery?
Well, I graduated pastry school, I think in 2002. We moved down to LA in 2003. We opened in 2005. So it was about 2 years, but I had decided probably about a year in that I wanted to open a location. It just took us a long time to find that location, build it out, and all of that. But I made good use of that time because I really leaned into our brand, figuring out what the packaging was going to be, what the cupcake was going to look like, how we were going to really differentiate ourselves, and continue to just get that word of mouth out as well during that time.
Yeah. So you felt that pull, and then it sort of took you a little while to implement, but fantastic. All right. This sort of is a great segue. So how do we know that it's the right time to launch an idea inside or outside of the workplace? We've got a few entrepreneurs on the screen here, but a few of us are still in the workplace as well. So how do we know it's the right time to launch?
Timing is a tricky one. I really just had a gut feeling that if I didn't open Sprinkles, someone else was going to do it pretty soon. I just had my feet so deeply into the baking world. Every time there was something about cupcakes, I just like my ears would perk up. I could just sense that there was generally more sort of energy happening in that space. And so a lot of times it's sort of instinctive. I think it always helps to know that you are solving a pressing problem. If you are truly solving a pressing problem, it's a great time to start your business. And then I think just being generally aware of market trends, which you typically are if you're really, immersed in the business that you're about to, or in the industry in which you're about to open a business in. And then look at the competitive landscape. So this is kind of a tricky one too, because with Sprinkles, we were first mover, right? We were the first ever cupcakes only bakery, the first sort of upscale cupcake. But with Pizzana, my new business, there's a pizza place on every block. So how exactly were we deciding that this was the right time for Pizzana? So when you look at a market and it's crowded, competitive, whatever word you want to use, that's obviously also a sign that there's a demand for whatever the product is, right? Or the service. So that's a good thing, but it's also going to be harder to make your mark and differentiate yourself. So you got to really lean into differentiation if the market's already established. But if the market's not there yet, that's when you really need to understand the timing of it. I always think back to an early investment I made when I was working in the .com world, and it was a company called Webvan, which I'm sure probably no one here has heard of, but tell me if this sounds familiar. It was a delivery service for groceries. And I thought it was the most genius idea. I was, a hardworking young professional. I did not have time to go grocery shopping. I barely had time to wash my clothes. And so I was like, this is awesome. Not only am I going to be a customer, but I'm going to buy the stock. Well, of course, Webvan went belly up in the .com bust, but who came around several years later was Instacart. So it was a great idea, but it was just a little bit too early. So that, just to give you an idea of like, it isn't just about the idea, it's also idea versus timing. But the more you know about your industry and the more you're in tune with like trends and what's going on, the better judge you're going to be of what the right time to start it is. Also, let me just add one thing. It's also what's personally right for you, right? Are you ready to like get in the trenches and start building a business, which is really hard work? Do you have the energy? Do you have the resolve? And do you have funding lined up? Are you being realistic about like the amount of money it's going to take to start this business? And do you have a co-founder or some sort of team that can help you, even just for liftoff?
I'm just curious with Pizzana, as you said, like, there is high demand, but there's high supply as well. So how did you decide how to differentiate yourself in that particular market?
So we were doing something very similar to what we did with Sprinkles, which was taking a product that already exists, but elevating it. Our product, which is created by our chef who hails from Naples, Italy, Daniele Uditi, is really exceptional. And we work with a slow fermented dough to create this really crisp crust, chewy with char, very much in the Neapolitan style, but it was unique in that it was still perfect for American taste because you could pick it up and eat it like a slice. So it was this perfect marriage of Neapolitan, like the best of Italy meets the best of American taste, because true Neapolitan pizza is quite soupy in the middle. You eat it with a fork and knife. So this was very much about the product and then building the brand around the product. We felt that we could be very differentiated, and it has turned out to be the case. But it's definitely, you got to make sure that you're able to build a really differentiated brand when there are a lot of other players.
And was there a lot of education around that as well, around like, the Neapolitan and then the and what you were trying to create?
There wasn't too much education just because pizza is such a beloved food, and really the product did the talking, right? People would taste this pizza and they would be sold. They didn't even really need to understand what we were doing. They walked into the space, and that's where brand is so important, right? Because it's not that people need to necessarily understand what you're doing, but they need to feel it and they need to taste it if it's food. And if they love it, they'll be back. They don't even really need to understand it.
I love that. Back to Martha Stewart here. So, you talk a lot in your book about why you think it's important that a founder of a brand really sort of expresses their identity and their story. Can you tell us here, a lot of us, some amount of us may feel like the product needs to speak for itself, and the founder's identity should sort of take a back seat, but we'd love to hear your experience and opinion on this.
Yeah, I think back when I was starting Sprinkles, personal branding just wasn't as much of a thing. And so I too, I talk about this in the book. I could have named the cupcakes Candace's Cupcakes, love that alliteration. And certainly when I was working out of my kitchen, that's how people knew my cupcakes. So they were Candace's Cupcakes, but I wanted the brand to be bigger than me. And just hospitality is really about giving. And food service to me was all about like giving my product and having it be about the experience the customer was having with my product. And I was very much just back in the kitchen. It wasn't, the Candace show. But I did start to realize as the market got more competitive, that it was going to be really important for me to step into my personal brand, because it was a way for people, it was a way to humanize the brand. I had a great origin story. Why wouldn't I share it? And it was also people by people, right? And particularly in this day and age, customers are really so skeptical of brands and brand promises. And the more that you can kind of step out from, I say, take off the apron, step out from out of the kitchen, wherever you are, and step into your personal brand, embody the values, the core values of your brand, the more people are going to trust you and your brand, right? It helps with transparency. It helps with trust. It helps with likability. It helps with differentiation, right? So it ends up being, if you use it well, a competitive advantage. And if you're, on TV like I was, if you are doing podcasts, if you are showing up on panels, etc., that's going to help you with your reach. That'll help with visibility. That will help, amplify you along with your brand. So I think there's so many reasons to encourage people to embrace their personal brand. And it's not just founders, right? Your personal brand is how you show up in the world. It's sort of your digital reputation. So it can be for anyone at a company as well. And the nice thing about personal brand is that it's like you can pack it in a little suitcase. It comes with you wherever you go. So, it can help you get the next job. Your personal brand comes with you. And for me, like, because I built my brand alongside Sprinkles, when I did step away from Sprinkles, it's now helping me with Pizzana. So when, we first opened our first Pizzana, we now have 5, but our initial one, the media showed up not because they cared about the pizza restaurant, but because they were like, well, what is Candace Nelson up to next? Why is she doing pizza? They were curious about me. And so the last thing I'll say about personal brand is that, part of showing up and claiming your personal brand is controlling the narrative, right? And so if you are allowing your narrative to potentially sort of just, I don't know, blow in the wind, someone else may take control of that narrative and you may not like what they do with it. So not to sound like, foreboding, but really the onus is on us to kind of like tell the world what our personal brand is and use that to amplify both our reputation and our businesses.
I love that advice that you can pack it up and take it with you, especially in this economy. I think a lot of our members are facing layoff or potential layoff. And I'm actually finding that as I'm helping people connect, the easiest thing to do is to show their personal brand. Like, we'll take a look at this person on Instagram and everything that they're doing and how entrepreneurial they are. And it does sort of, it shows up for them. It's like a sponsor for their resume. It's fantastic advice. This is the last question, I think, and then I really want to move on to audience questions. But how do you nurture your team members and the cultures of your company?
Well, I knew when I started Sprinkles that I wanted it to be sort of the antithesis of what I'd experienced in investment banking. There was one managing director who used to come out from his office. Our offices were in San Francisco, but a lot of our business was in Silicon Valley because we were working with technology companies. And it was like a 45-minute drive without traffic. But that whole thoroughfare is known for really bad traffic. So he would come out and look around at all the financial analysts and basically randomly choose one to go with him to the meeting, not because they were adding value in any way. They were literally like a human body so that he could use the carpool lane. And these were days before iPhones. So when you were taken away from your computer, like you were in that car for 5 hours down for the meeting and back, you basically had to pull an all-nighter because you hadn't been able to do any of your work. So this was like the level of company culture I was coming from. And I was like, I want it to be the opposite. And it is very much, company culture is just how you make people feel. And of course, at that investment bank, they were not making us feel human. So I was leading with that, right? And it has to come from the top. And Charles and I were very, very much in sync in this way. We wanted Sprinkles to be the best job anyone had ever had. And we brought so much joy into work every day that it was almost sort of infectious the way that everybody else felt joyful. And I think it's really important, you know, to define what your core values are as a business, to define what your purpose is, and then not just communicate it to your team, but also hire with that in mind. Make sure that the people that you are hiring are aligned and on board with where you're going. I'll never forget, there were times early on, you know, we didn't have a lot of, Charles and I didn't have any experience in the restaurant and bakery industry. So talk about imposter syndrome. We just figured everybody else who worked in the industry knew better than we did. And so from time to time, we'd hire from some business that we really admired and bring someone in, and we'd be like, okay, great, they're going to teach us everything. And what ended up happening most of the time was they weren't a cultural fit. Charles and I had built such an incredibly special and unique company culture, and we'd figured it out, you know, on our own, so that when somebody else came in and they wanted to tell us to do it a certain way, it wasn't the Sprinkles way. And at the end of the day, our company culture was so much more important than any sort of industry expertise. And so I can't highlight that enough, that, you know, creating a work environment where people feel seen, appreciated, where there's open dialogue, where you honor work-life balance, and where you reward people. You know, not every company can reward people with money. It depends on what, you know, phase of the business you're in, but certainly with praise, certainly with credit, and offering, you know, opportunity for advancement, and letting people know, like, if this company grows, this is where I see you growing with it. People love that. They love to know that there's, you know, a track for them if they're enjoying the work where they are, and that you have their growth in mind. So comes from the top, but hire accordingly, and it's incredibly important.
It's so important. Yeah, I'm going to skip over the next couple of questions, because we've got some entrepreneurs, as I said, on the online here. We would love to hear from you. Any questions for Candace?
Hi, my name is Claudia. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Claudia.
Hi. So, I kind of like, my question is not so much like maybe like entrepreneurial, but I will not forget the first time I ever saw your cupcakes. I'm from South Texas, and so like we hear about things like 5 years later from when they're like popular. And so I'll never forget, like, someone shared like on their Instagram stories or like Facebook maybe, and they had all these pictures of your cupcakes in a line. And I remember like Googling like cupcakes with the dot on the top, like, where do you find them? Like, I had no idea what it was. So I guess, like, what was the idea behind the look of your cupcakes? Because it was such a cool for so many people.
Thank you for noticing that. And I love that story. That's amazing. So the idea behind Sprinkles itself was about putting a modern spin on a classic treat. And so the brand identity, the look and feel of the product had to represent what I was doing with the product itself. So as I said, like reinventing cupcakes from the inside out. And so everything from the ingredients to the recipe to the technique to baking them fresh all day long was really special and elevated. And the way that we frosted the cupcakes with an offset spatula instead of like that production style, piping bag was very intentional, because what I wanted to say to people without having to say it was, this is an artisanal product. This is handmade. This is handcrafted, including the way it's frosted. This is not your commercial, factory style cupcake. They all look generally the same, but they all have their individual personalities. I opted for chocolate brown cupcake wrappers because I thought they were more sophisticated looking than the, old school pastel wrappers. And then once I was done with all of that, I thought, well, I can't just put a traditional sprinkle on top of this very modern cupcake. I have to reinvent the sprinkle itself. And so I started playing around with all sorts of decorations and ultimately landed on this modern dot design, 2 different colored dots, one smaller one on top of a larger one. And it was just a very modern graphic style of decoration. And it also did the work of differentiating my product and branding it, right? Because how do you brand a piece of food? It's really hard. It's something that we really thought long and hard about with Pizzana, but ultimately decided not to do anything because it would be too gimmicky. But with a sprinkle, you have that very natural sort of opportunity to brand the top. And so I thought, how can I do that? And so we ended up with the modern dot decoration, and it was so important to our business because, as you said, you could tell a sprinkles from the rest just by the way it looked, but also we were able to trademark that modern dot on top of the cupcake, which in a food business, very hard to trademark anything, right? And there's no defensible moat. As I said, we opened Sprinkles, we were a first mover, but then all of a sudden there were cupcake bakeries popping up across the country. And so it was a very important piece of intellectual property that one of very few things that we could protect.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
I had a question, and before I ask, I just have to say, Carla, who just left, we were on a call once and we were talking about how much we loved your book. So it's so cool to be able to hear from you. But I'd love to know, what were your tips or any advice you have for preparing to meet with someone like Martha Stewart, or someone who's like one of the people you admire in your industry?
Well, because you're nervous. Because to help me understand, preparing in what way? Are you having a meeting with the person, or are you?
Yeah, just like feeling nervous and then also wanting to make the most of it, because it's like not an opportunity you get all the time.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I get a lot of people reaching out to me, and it's really, really hard to respond to people when they are not targeted with their requests. They're not specific, because it is just it's overwhelming. And when you are meeting with someone who is successful, they're probably really busy. They want to help. Their heart is in the right place, but maybe they're just absolutely bombarded from all sides and they can't make it work. So make it easy for them. Make that initial ask really easy. One of the women I currently mentor, she is founder of a bakery on the East Coast. She reached out to me. She followed me on Instagram for a while. She was always leaving comments. You get to know people who are regularly commenting on your social media. And then after a little while, she slipped into my DMs and asked me a few really targeted questions. And I was like, you know what? I can whip off these answers really quickly. So I'm going to do that. And so that made me feel good, right? And then all of a sudden she had her engagement with me, and she waited, and she was very nice and thankful. I'd love to set up a call. What would you think of this? And I'll keep it to this much time. And making it really easy for people to knock it off their list successfully is so important. When I get amorphous asks like, can I pick your brain? Can we go get coffee? It honestly makes me feel ill, because I'm like, I want to, but no, that sounds like you're so unfocused. I don't know what you want from me. I don't have time to just go have coffee. But by the same token, I'm so conflicted, right? Because this is my mission in the world. I want to help women. So help them help you by being really specific and developing that rapport, maybe sort of slowly and over time.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful.
Any other questions? I actually have one. In this like really unstable, funky economy, and as I mentioned before, a lot of us are facing layoffs or there's the threat of layoffs. How, while you were going through it, did you sort of mitigate your anxiety and just sort of trust in the like trust in faith that it was all going to work out? For some of us who are more say junior in our careers and haven't been through recessions before, or any really unstable periods, like how do you just have faith that you are going to work it out, that you are going to find your path, that trying out sometimes random careers, or like you said, just being open to these opportunities will lead to something? Like what would you say to your younger self now?
I think I would say that everything has value, even when at first glance you don't think it does, right? Like the things I learned I didn't want in my business at investment banking, right? And then I talk about this in the book, in college was initially doing a lot of theater. I thought maybe I would, pursue an acting career. And my acting professor was like, no, I don't think so. He said to me, is there anything else you can do? Which I was really devastated by. But at the same time, like life comes full circle. It's not like I'm acting, but I've been on a lot of TV, and who's to say that I would have felt comfortable doing that if I hadn't had that experience? It's really amazing how, every experience really comes together to give you that, unique insight, that unique talent that you're able to share with the world. And I do think that one of the greatest things about getting older is that you do have this perspective. Like I've now been through a couple of downturns, right? And so I do know that the market goes down and the market comes back up. And it's not that I'm not scared and I'm not anxious and I'm not nervous, but I do have enough faith in myself. I've seen that I have my own back and I can get through a hard time, and I've built that resilience that I know that I can do it, right? And it's not that it's always going to be great or you're always on the right path, but I have the perspective now to know that I'm strong enough to figure it out. And so any sort of time of reckoning or feeling lost, it's so hard when you're going through it. But that's when you're sort of grinding the diamonds, right? That's when you're figuring out what you're made of. And that's when you're learning all the lessons. I have to say that Sprinkles really was, it was very challenging leading up to it. But once we opened, it was kind of lightning in a bottle. Like it was very instantly successful. And I didn't learn a ton of lessons until things got a little more challenging later, right? When the market started to get really crowded, when I was having to innovate to differentiate myself again, even after Sprinkles with Pizzana, opening into a crowded market, trying to, make it in the restaurant world and not being an instant hit, like having to really work hard at it for a long time. That's where I've learned my best lessons. So I know it's hard to hear when you're going through like a challenging time, but this is when you find out what you're made of, and when you learn all those most valuable lessons that will serve you so well later.
Thank you for that. Yeah, if we don't have any other questions, I just want to say thank you so much for giving us your time. It's been so fantastic.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you for providing this amazing community for women. I wish you had been around when I was coming up in the world. It's so valuable.
Thank you. All right.
Everybody.
Have a great week. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.